Okay. You have fought with bulls. You have learned from the horse's mouth. You have herded cats, and now you have eaten worms. So now we're gonna fight with lions. This last session, as I mentioned, it really kind of identifies the skills that Community Foundation, one of the skills that community foundations need to really be engaging in a community leadership role. And that is the deep engagement in public policy work. Now, many of you do this on all different kinds of levels, and as Connecticut pointed out, you may be doing a lot more of it than you even know you are. You're just not calling it advocacy, you're not calling it policy. But these two people and these two organizations are doing really high-level, in-depth public policy work, and I think we all have a great deal to learn from them. Mary Jo Meisner, on my left, is the Vice President for Communications, Community Relations, and Public Affairs here at the Boston Foundation. And she's responsible for all the Foundation's communications, media relations, public affairs, and civic leadership activities, including the Boston Indicators Project and the Foundation's public policy activities. She, in addition to Lou, is a registered lobbyist, and that will be a topic of discussion. But prior to joining the Foundation, Mary Jo spent 25 years in the newspaper business. She was the editor of the Milwaukee Journal, and she was also the city editor of the Washington Post, among many other positions. Lou Feldstein, many of you know, as is President and Chief Executive Officer of the New Hampshire Charitable Foundation. He has been there since 1986. And prior to that, many of you may not know, also worked in government. He worked for John Lindsay for about 8 years, from 1966 to 72, and tells me there's a very good recent documentary that is worth watching. And also, some of you may have participated with, Lou's done a number of things, of course, which we'll hear about, but some of you may have participated with Lou when he worked very closely with Robert Putnam on the social capital benchmark survey, which many of you may have participated in. So we will have a conversation about public policy, and hopefully we'll have plenty of time for questions from you all towards the end. So I asked, I'm going to sit back a little bit. I asked both of you to participate in this because you are actively involved in public policy work. But we need to kind of know what that is. What does that mean? Mm-hmm. So what I'd love to do is get each of you to give a couple of examples of some of the stuff you do, but then I'd like to draw the lessons from those examples rather than just getting into too much of the detail. So, Mary Jo, you want to give us some examples of some of the work you're doing?
Sure. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Boston Foundation. We're glad you're here. Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay, good. A couple of examples on public policy work. We've got a really very fresh one. And I'll have to say this is kind of, for us, the piece de resistance of what the Boston Foundation has been working towards. In January, the legislature here in Massachusetts passed the Education Reform Act of 2010. This was an act to close the achievement gap in Massachusetts. And there was another ed reform bill that was very significant in the state. It was passed in 1993. This was seen as the second part and the second phase of that. And the Boston Foundation, I think we can say without patting ourselves on the back too much, was instrumental in getting this legislation passed. We created a coalition called the Race to the Top Coalition that was made up of about 15 or 16 organizations that we brought together as kind of a neutral convener to help shape this legislation and then help get it passed in a very, in a remarkably short period of time. It took from September to January. And there were lots of forces that came forward at the right time to help us do that. It wasn't just us. by any means, but we have been, if there's one topic that the Boston Foundation has been primarily focused on throughout its almost 100-year history, but certainly since Paul Grogan has become president, it is education, particularly K-12. And the whole notion of education reform is one that a day doesn't go by here without us talking about. So it actually gave me goosebumps to think that we were involved so significantly in passing that law. I feel emotional about it when I think about it. And when you think about what we're able to do to help kids in urban areas in this state get the kind of education they really need and should have, it's just such a perfect example of what we think a community foundation could and should be doing. Another couple of quick examples would be we were instrumental in creating the idea of a cultural facilities fund that grew out of work that we've been doing over the years in the whole cultural sector. And it was an idea that came up and was baked here at the Boston Foundation. And we lobbied, we wrote the legislation and we lobbied to get it passed. And so for the first time in the state of Massachusetts, there is money that is set aside. This is hundreds of millions of dollars that has gone to help cultural institutions in a match kind of formula. It gives them money through a competitive process, but hundreds of organizations throughout the state have now received this money to help either renovate their facilities, expand them, or build them anew. And we tied it effectively to economic competitiveness, to the whole tourism industry here, and in addition to the cultural assets that these are. We're trying now that fund, because of the recession, has been rated a little bit, so we have to kind of go back and lobby anew to get that money restored. But we are optimistic that that will happen, but it's had a huge impact already. And just one other one I would mention is that in the housing area, we created something called the Commonwealth Housing Task Force here in Massachusetts. It's a big tent umbrella organization made up of that we run here at the foundation. I staff it, and it is made up of business, housing advocates, soup to nuts in the whole housing area. And from it came, once again, some legislation that is smart growth housing legislation designed to incent communities to build housing in a smart growth kind of way in their communities. And housing is not easy to get passed and built. Particularly in our suburban areas. There's a lot of demand and little supply, and people don't want it, and there's a lot of NIMBYism. And so the fact that we were able to get this legislation passed, and now 30 communities have passed these smart growth housing districts, and that represents, I think, 10,000 housing units that are starting to be underway at a time when we really need it, once again, for our economic competitiveness and for the young people that need to stay in our state. So those are just three examples.
And Lou, how would you answer that question?
Hi, everybody. Three quick examples. First one is an issue that it's also, I guess you might say, it's education. We've been trying to reduce the prison population in the state. Like every other state in the country, our prison growth has been growing phenomenally. So it's now we spend about twice as much on sending people to prison as we do to higher education. And so we set out to see if we could reduce that. Proceeded on a two-pronged basis, and how we proceed is more interesting than the substance. But we started with knowing we had to move the governor. In order to move the governor, who's a Democrat, we had to make sure that he knew his back was covered with the Republican Attorney General who was going to run against him, like a possibility. So I went first to the AG, talked through with her, negotiated out a basis on which she would be willing to support an effort to reduce the prison census. And then the two of us went to the governor, and then separately I went slowly over time to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and the Speaker and the Senate President, and gradually, as well as the minority parties, and gradually got all of them committed over this. There's a period of months, At the same time, the key to this was also persuading the feds to pick New Hampshire. There's a program that the Pew Foundation runs called the Justice Center that has focused on no more than 6 or 8 states at any one time for a 3-year period to help states reduce the prison population. First time we called Pew, they wouldn't take our call, literally. We couldn't get to any of the professional staff. They said, in effect, gee, New Hampshire, too white, too small, too rural, who cares? We can only do 6 or 8 states. I mean, they were a little more polite, but we couldn't get past the secretary. And we made several calls, and, you know, a community foundation called them, they just didn't care. So we enlisted the help of our 2 senators, Judd Gregg and Jean Shaheen, and at least they agreed to talk with us. They still wouldn't meet with us. They finally agreed we could come to Washington. This is a big deal, right? They're going to spend an hour talking to us.
Right.
We're not going to bite them. So we went and met with them. Finally, and it took a long time, they finally agreed begrudgingly, we'll come to New Hampshire. Okay, okay. They came, and eventually we persuaded them. So the 6 or 7 states they're working on now are Texas, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, Illinois, Kansas, and New Hampshire. You know, so we're so and we've now 2 days ago, 2 months ago, the House passed a plan, a substantial funding plan for this. 2 days ago, the Senate passed the plan. We've received a number of, we've worked at the federal level as well, a number of federal grants. Governor's going to sign it sometime in the next couple of weeks. So that's, then we have to do it. But I think that over the next 3 years, the goal is to reduce it, the census by 25% in the state prisons and another 20% in the next 2 years after that. That's number one. The other 2 are going to be much quicker. The second one also involves a state and federal effort. It's dealing with the energy issue. We're very active on trying to accelerate the pace at which the state tries to go a little greener, and along the way to try and see it as a business development opportunity for a lot of the New England states who are losing our manufacturing. And so we've secured a number of federal grants, and there's a state program, but I can say more about how we've done that. But that's also moving along successfully. And the third, not so successful, has been an effort to block gambling. We, like you all down here, are struggling with how to balance our budget. Gambling's on the agenda. If you look at a map of the Northeast, everything north of Maryland actually has gambling, except for New Hampshire, Vermont, and Maine. New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts. And there's great pressure. The governor here has agreed to do it. We're trying to keep it out, and I'm not sure we're going to be successful. But in all of these items, I should say, we are heavily involved in the legislature itself. We have 6 of us registered as lobbyists, including myself. I wear my lobby pin to the annual meeting each year. It's a bright orange pin, and I wear it just to norm lobbying, so that I say to people, this is not a fashion statement. I know I don't look good in orange, but that's my lobbying button, because we want people to understand that lobbying is okay for philanthropy.
Wear it under your flag pin.
Wear
Wear it under your flag pin, you should.
my flying
Your
pin?
flag.
Oh, flag pin, yes. Oh, flag pin, yes. That's an idea. So, but we'll say more about how we do it later.
Okay, great. You can hang on to that for a minute. So both of you are working on these issues at a very high level. You're meeting with the legislature. You're meeting with the governor. You said you wrote the legislation.
No, well, on a couple of those we
On a
did.
couple of you
We
did,
helped
yeah.
write the education.
Yes. So how did you, number one, why do you think it's important to be engaged in policy at that level? And where did you start and how did you get there? Even in the past, in the last session, Clotilde sort of jumped right in. Jennifer's been doing this a little more quietly for many years. Did you jump right in, Lou, because you had been working in government, and was the board ready for that? Did you take it slow? Foundations have different paths. What was yours, and what do you advise for others?
I jumped right in, and they almost pushed me right out. So it was not a. I talked about it at the time I was interested in the job. I did it for the same reason that everybody else is here, because our dollars and grants alone can never, in the terms I use, which my staff gets very upset about, I never say it publicly. Our grants are like a pee hole in the snow. You know, it doesn't amount to much. So that's a philanthropic term. So you can't do much with just your grants. And you know, and we're a $450 million foundation, so we're distributing $35 million a year in a state of 1.3 million people, and it's still nothing. It's nothing on all the issues we care about. So we can't do anything unless you somehow move the public sector, which I thought both the last speakers made so clear. And so we knew we had to do it. When I took the job, I went to see the governor, who was then John Sununu Sr. before he became Bush 1's chief of staff. Told him we would get into public policy, said, I know our politics are not the same, but I'm hoping we can agree on some issues and work on those. We didn't need to fight. And he looked at me, and the great John Sununuism said, Feldstein, I know all about your liberal politics and for Lindsay in New York and civil rights. If you're as smart as everyone tells me, within 10 minutes you know that I'm right and you're wrong. Otherwise it'll take you 6 months. And I put both feet in my mouth, and in the end we had a couple of fights, and it was not unpleasant. It was not pleasant. I had to be taken over to the corner office, where he gave me a tongue lashing about how things work in New Hampshire, and I was told by my board chairman in no uncertain terms, you just say, yes, sir, Governor, thank you, Governor, thank you, Governor. It was very embarrassing. But my board chair said, you're not ready to go arm in arm with John Sununu yet, so, and we're not ready to do it. So we had to find a way around it, and I'm going to stop after this. It turned out we found a way very easily, not through anything we were brilliant enough to doing. A lot of the environmental groups concerned about the fast pace of growth in the state were pushing for ways to preserve the state, preserve state land. And we were instrumental in trying to put all that together. And the lesson I learned from it was that the same people who were horrified that we might testify or that the Community Foundation would take sides on political issues, saw nothing political about us being involved in trying to save land. You know, the Yankees don't like people, they only like the land. So, I mean, it was a real lesson. The same people who objected to us being involved in public policy were perfectly fine and thought it was perfectly right that I be the first person to testify, or second person to testify before the legislature on this, to work with the Governor Sununu on creating a plan. So a lesson for me early on was getting the right issue early, and not picking a fight too soon.
So a relatively non-controversial issue and something you could win on?
Yes.
Did it have to be a winning issue?
At that stage, it was important not to take on taxes, abortion, or something where we're going to get our teeth kicked in, but to try and find an issue, not only that we could win on, but where we alone weren't the drivers. There had to be some momentum, somebody else behind it. We could do something, but if we're out there alone, we just don't have it. We need some momentum.
How about you, Mary Jo? Either one, doesn't matter.
Thanks. Well, I think both ways. We jumped right in, and also, though, it's our heavy emphasis on public policy and lobbying has evolved. The board at the Boston Foundation, when they sought a new president in 2001, very specifically wanted to move into the area of taking the Boston Foundation beyond grant making and making it a place where it was using a whole set of other assets and tools beyond just making grants. And they chose Paul Grogan as their president. That was a good choice because Paul's a very public animal and had a distinguished career in the public sector and in the nonprofit sector doing public affairs kinds of things and making change happen. I was his first hire, and I'm a very public person. I've been in the newspaper business, as you heard, for 25 years, and believe that you make an impact by putting the issues out there, talking about them, and getting change driven through that kind of approach. So Paul and I kind of set out to create a civic leadership focus and arm of the Boston Foundation, and have built that up where really there wasn't much of anything. And we started more where we focused on being the go-to place for knowledge and information about Boston, being a place where we would commission and do a lot of important research. We had the Boston Indicators Project here, but we really didn't exploit it to any great extent, so we used that kind of as our platform, digitized it, and then started using it as a guide to help us really understand what's happening in our city and region, and let's commission original research to really get to deeper into these issues. Much of what we do in a public policy area grows out of our understanding of the data and the research, and then it allows us to convene in a neutral kind of way as a result. I mean, the facts are the facts, and the data and the research done by an incredible array of think tanks and academic, research institutions that we have here in Boston gives us this ability to kind of bring people together to talk about these important issues, but to do it in a way where people are like, well, yeah, of course, that's what it's telling us. And because we're a community foundation, we're here for the long haul. We've been here for 100 years. We're going to hopefully be here for 100 more. And people see us as a place that is neutral, and then they can come in a nonpartisan way to do these. So we kind of started evolving into, out of this research and these forums we were holding, and a lot of use of media. We really, and obviously I'm out of the newspaper business, so we like reporters, we like stories, we like coverage, and Paul's a spokesperson on lots of different things. So we leveraged all that to really get to a place where we started bringing people together to say, okay, what's the next step? We put lots of task forces together in some of these things. We're always doing this with partners and bringing people together. It's not just the Boston Foundation. And so we evolved to a place about 5 years ago where we got heavily into public policy off that kind of platform. And that's when we created a set of guidelines on public policy that our board approved. That's when I registered as a lobbyist. I also have a director of public affairs who's a lobbyist working for me, where we got heavily engaged in working on issues at the State House and very purposefully driving a set of initiatives and getting legislation passed. So,
what got the board to the place where it wanted to hire someone like a Paul Grogan, who was going to be a very public figure? So the board decided it wanted to do that. Do you know what got them to that place?
Well, I wasn't here then, and neither was Paul, actually. So, but there's some paper on some of this stuff that we both were privy to. I think there was a feeling like, well, yeah, this is a great place, but and it's done some great things. Nobody knew about it except the grantees that got the grants. It's very under the radar, the Boston Foundation, distinguished, but who knew about us? I ran a newspaper company here. I'd never heard of the Boston Foundation. I mean, it's just, so you're kind of, it's the issue of, well, how much money do you have? How much can you really put out there and have any kind of true impact, that is really going to bring together public monies and other private monies and nonprofits in a bigger way? Well, it all spoke to the need to do a public, more of a public kind of role. So I think the board members at that point, our board has changed quite a bit since then, but it was starting to be filled less with lawyers and people that were put on it as a result of the early structure of the board, and became more of a corporate board. Started realizing there was a vacuum of leadership, corporate leadership in our community, consolidations and mergers, CEOs leaving, nobody stepping up to the plate. It's time for this permanent institution to play a role. And hey, we can do more than just make $30 million in grants every year, or whatever we were doing at that point. We're much more than that now, but and I think they thought we can have beyond grant making. We can use tools to have an even higher impact. So I think that's what drove them.
Oftentimes when we think about government, we think about money. They clearly are the biggest funder, but right now government is cutting way back. And it's going to be bad for years and years and years, state and local government in particular. And Lou, I know you speak very strongly about this, but there's tremendous need out there. There's tremendous human need, and there will be. And taxes are not going to be raised except through gambling and various other things. What is a community foundation's role in these kinds of times?
I think it's Mary Jo's term.
Oh, come on, Lou.
It's hard to think of some way that we can make the fundamental shift that is comparable to the damage being done to the decimation of the public sector. At a minimum, among the things, the things that you see in all the documents that are out on the front table here about trying to support the sector and making strategic choices about the key allies in the sector, and with the government trying to do what we can to persuade them and help them, at least in this time, make some use the problem as a chance to change the way government works. But it's not going to substantially increase the service. It's not going to fill those gaps. We don't have the horsepower to do that. We collectively, there's no public will to put the piece in there, and whatever improvements we try to make within government aren't going to fill those holes if the question is as narrow as that.
Well, or
as broad.
Or also, should community foundations, especially those of you who have tremendous resources, I mean, not relative to government, but you could support a lot of food banks. You could do stuff where governments cut back. You could support education to a little degree. I mean, should you?
We're still none of us are ever going to have the muscle and the heft and the weight and the firepower to fill the big gaps in services. So what's the analogy that Bill, the guy from California who runs a grant, Bill, you know his name?
Bill Gates?
Somerville. What?
Bill Somerville.
Somerville, yeah. We used to say that that community foundations and government are both in the gross level in the same business. We're all about moving people to a better life, but they're like a bus or a train. They carry a lot more people. We're like a motor scooter. We don't carry many people, but we can start and stop faster and make the turns faster. I mean, so it's something on that, and it sounds simplistic, but it's something at that gross level about trying to make marginal improvements in the way you distribute your own funds, to go more to capital and use the kind of PRIs and MRIs that are possible that many people here are doing, to try and create more transactional ways that bring new donors in. But then on the government part, you're still just trying to move them slightly. You know, they're big, and so you just move them a little bit.
I agree with Lou that you can't possibly, fill back in for government funds, and especially in the whole human service area. It's just, you're not going to ever be able to really make much difference, nor should we, I think, that way. But what I think we can do is, I think that we've kind of gotten the legislature here and the administration to think of us as their think tank. So we can come up with ideas and ways to get things done, to use public dollars more efficiently. We bring various forces together. So collaboration, which has never been, Neil Pierce came here several years ago. We had him do one of those reports about our region and everything. And the thing that everybody remembers from that report is that Boston lacks the collaboration gene. We're not good at doing that, but actually we've really moved the needle on that. There's lots of collaborative efforts now, and it's through it, there you can really leverage, small dollar to big impact. Legislation, this education legislation, there's not a lot of money involved in that. It's loosening up and getting rid of strictures that shouldn't be there, letting schools make decisions about how to educate the kids that they have, as opposed to having unions tell you how to do that. It's a whole set of changes that allow things to loosen up or better decisions to be made. And so I think that's the role that we can play, where you can really leverage dollars in a much bigger, more powerful way and get more bang for the buck.
How do we help community foundations do this? What skills do they need? What skills does the CEO need? Do they need to hire for this? Do they need a lot of money? Well, what do we need?
I would say that money is not the critical piece. On very few of the 40 or 50 projects, the big projects we've done with the public sector over the years, very few of them are ones in which we've put a huge amount of money, even for us, in those projects. But they're very staff intense, and they take staff leadership at the very senior level. I always find the more difficult question as to whether people can lead this who haven't been in the public sector. If you're not a groupie, if that isn't the game you're drawn to, if in your spare time you're not reading those columns in the paper, you're not hanging out with people in public policy, it seems to me, this may be heretical, but it seems to me that hard to ask someone to suddenly get trained and do this. Either you like the game or you don't, and if you like it, but I only have a universe of one I'm looking at, or one foundation, and my predecessors didn't do it, and I do because I can't help myself. But I assume that, as your stories, are people who are in government in some ways before. And I could go through this stuff, and I've had this debate with Janet Topolsky about whether you could train people who've never done it before.
And?
She hasn't persuaded me, but maybe people will do it and will show us that there are other ways to do it.
I don't think you
yeah.
can train
You don't
people
think
to
you can
do
train it?
this. I think you've got to really love it.
Yeah.
You've got to get in there and, you know, rub shoulders with people and love it. And, you know, you do this for 24/7. I mean,
Right.
some of this stuff is there, you know, no rest for the weary. And you've really got to, I think you have to hire experts. I really do. You've got to hire people that know how to do this, that have skill sets either in media or in public policy or public affairs, or, you know, that whole set of tools. Just as you hire program officers to
I love
with
your
this-
notion about 24/7. Part of it is that a lot of this it's all about relationships, right?
Yeah.
And those don't happen just between 9 and 5. It's who do you hang out with? Who do you
Right.
go for beer with? Who do you talk to in the middle of the night and say, God, did you see who so-and-so's running, or what are they
Yeah,
doing?
right.
If you're not wanting to talk about that, how can you suddenly get a person and say, all right, go do this? You can't do it between 9 to 5 if you're not into it between 5 and 9 all the way around again.
Right, right. And you have to have relationships. I mean, really. I mean, you heard Lou right at the beginning talking about, well, I went here and I talked to the governor, and then I went to the Senate president, and then I did this, and then. I mean, that's how legislation gets passed, whether you like it or not. It's all about building the relationship and persuading people and horse trading and doing all that kind of stuff. And I can't imagine doing that with people who, you know, I don't know, they're shy of retiring, or they just don't communicate well in that way, or...
Well, just to play devil's advocate a little bit, Jennifer and I tell a story where in Rochester, with this early childhood work, there became a time where the Community Foundation really had to advocate for increased funding for subsidies for early childhood. And the board was wary like many boards.
Mm-hmm.
And Jennifer tentatively brought it to the board about how we needed to write a letter and wanted other board members to write a letter. And if you had talked with them about advocacy in the abstract, they probably would have said, are you kidding? That is not our job.
Right.
But you talk to them about it in the specific,
Yeah.
and they're not
Yep.
people who had work in government. Now, there were a few people on the board who did have public policy experience, and that was very important. But one of the donors who had given said, well, duh, we've been doing this for 15 years. Of course we write a letter on this. This isn't, they don't think of it as advocacy. It's just protecting their investment. So,
It's just a letter. I mean, I think what we're talking about here is, you know...
well, but it can lead to more.
Of course, but I think if you're going to get into it and get into it big time, I think you have to say, we're going to have some resources to do this. And, you know, so let's say you expand your resources. Well, who are you going to hire for that? You know, for that new job or that new position. You're probably going to hire people that have that kind of expertise. Yeah, I think you can walk before you run, but I think if you're going to play in this space, I think you have to go into it really understanding what it's going to take. Otherwise, don't do it. You can write letters occasionally, but, you know, don't do it then. And I think you can make persuasive arguments to your board about why you should do it.
And then tell us then what your board looks like. In doing this, you've said your board has changed. Have you brought more people on from the public sector who at least understand the public sector, et cetera? No?
No, we don't have any public sector members of our board. And we have, you know, we have people of influence in Boston. We have business leaders, CEOs. We have college presidents. We have people who run large nonprofits. We have PR people. We have people who are very identifiable in Boston and the region, and they are known. Our board is seen as it's the best board to be on in Boston. You know, so if you are a mover and shaker, you kind of want to be on our board. It doesn't mean everybody's got the same set of strengths and they're all big political people at all, but it's seen as a powerful board. Major lawyers, stuff like that. We don't have public officials on our board.
How about you, Lou?
So this is a different model. where the board has all those adjectives attached to it, best board, and people want to go and no one says no and all those things. But most of the members of the board are players, and none of them are now in public life, but we, by design, have actively recruited and sought people who are major figures in the political game, in addition to being lawyers or business leaders. They can be both. But we've got the former Republican Speaker of the House, the former Democratic Attorney General, and so forth. And we explicitly want people who are poster people in their parties, because we're in such a I shouldn't say bipartisan state. It's a hostile state. You know, they're all red and blue. There's no purple. So we need people who are flag carriers on both sides on the board publicly, and they are players on the issues. They are actively making calls all the time on the issues we're involved in. So when we come to the table with an issue, it's not, let us tell you about where everybody is. As soon as we raise the issue, people have done the calculus in their mind. They know where the governor is. They know where both parties are. They're thinking about who's got to be reached. And we use them. They're not registered lobbyists, but they are players in it. So it's a different strategy. I'll say one more word about a different board strategy. It's a small board by design. It's only 9 members or 10 members. And the board meets monthly for 3 hours at a time. That's a heavy commitment. And we do that purposely to build enough comity, it's C-O-M-I-T-Y, not E-D-Y, among the board, so that R's and D's can cross lines occasionally because of somebody else. So I need Donna, the former Republican Speaker of the House, to be willing to step away from the Republican position sometimes, because she has enough trust in the other board members. I can't ask it often of her, but I need her to do that. The only way she'll do that is if she meets with them regularly and they do enough other work together that occasionally we can find some openings to do that. And the same, so we don't ever meet, we do very few committee meetings. We try and work entirely as a committee of the whole, but it's all around the notion of how do you build up enough trust and reciprocity within this group that people who, if they weren't there with their political positions, would not move their positions. But we're in a different position because it's a very divided state. The line is very close. The parties are quite far apart, and politically it's different than it is here. So we need to do that in order to build a base.
I'm going to turn out to the audience in just a minute. Have either of you been successful at engaging donors in this work? Mary Jo.
You mean in terms of funding? Or in
funding,
any way?
lobbying, working with their own networks, whatever it might be.
Well, we'll engage lots of people in helping us get legislation passed. Yeah, there's very strict ethics law in Massachusetts, so you cannot lobby for a certain, there's a ceiling on the number of hours you can lobby without being a registered lobbyist, so we have to be very careful about that. But we will engage people who turn out to be our donors in helping us get this, come testify at this hearing about this ed reform legislation, so we'll do that. We have been trying to encourage our donors to co-invest with us, so our grant making is also aligned with this public policy stuff. So there's opportunities for donors to come in and invest on various kinds of strategies that include a public policy component. So in that way, yeah, we're not trying to specifically go after our donors to get them to get heavily involved in the advocacy end of things.
Well, you have the microphone. I assume one of the questions behind that is, do you lose donors because of getting involved in this? Mm-hmm. So you might speak. You've been quite successful in drawing people in on that annual funds.
Yeah, we don't. We really, I don't think, have lost really any donors that were donors of ours because we're involved in public policy. Now, you don't know about the people that aren't, that have decided not to come to you, perhaps. In fact, I think, pioneered the whole idea of a civic leadership fund. We created a fund years ago an annual fundraising fund for our operating budget to help us raise money to support these activities, because we were really expanding them. They're expensive. I mean, we've expanded the staff and everything. So we raised this year $1.1 million. We've done that for a couple of years now, and it started our first year. We raised $250,000. So we're literally going out to the community. Some of our donors, some are donors, and some are not, and saying, if you like what we do, if you like the fact that we're moving the needle on these issues, if you like the fact that there is a neutral convening force on this stuff, please give us some money to help support that. And it's been pretty successful.
I think that's a wonderful model for all of us, and others have done it. East Bay has done it quite successfully. Charlotte's done it, and in many cases, the donors are, as you point out, they don't even have funds sometimes.
Oh,
with you,
no.
but
Lots
people
of
will say,
them.
"I'll support this even if we don't put a fund with it."
And then we run a full-page ad in the Boston Globe that lists all their names, and these are the folks that have supported the civic leadership activities of the Boston Foundation. People like to be in that ad.